Before we state so confidently that life is desirable or merits our gratitude, let us for once calmly compare the sum of pleasures which are in any way possible and which a person can enjoy in their life with the sum of the sufferings which are in any way possible and can come to them in life. I do not think it will be difficult to strike the balance. In the long run, however, it is quite superfluous to dispute whether there is more good or evil in the world, for the mere existence of evil decides the matter, since evil can never be wiped off, and consequently can never be balanced, by the good that exists along with or after it. 1,000 pleasures does not compensate for one pain. Petrarch. For that thousands had lived in happiness and joy would never do away with the anguish and death agony of one individual. And just as little does my present well-being undo my previous sufferings. Therefore, were the evil in the world even 100 times less than it is, its mere existence would still be sufficient to establish a truth that may be expressed in various ways, although always only somewhat indirectly, namely, that we have not to be pleased, but rather sorry about the existence of the world, that its non-existence would be preferable to its existence, that it is something which at the bottom ought not to be, and so on. Byron's expression of the matter is exceedingly fine. Our life is a false nature. 'Tis not in the harmony of things, this hard decree, this ineradicable taint of sin, this boundless upas, this all-blasting tree whose root is earth, whose leaves and branches be the skies, which rain their plagues on men like dew. Death, disease, bondage, all the woes we see, and worse, the woes we see not, which throb through the immedicable soul, with heartaches ever new. If the world and life were an end in themselves, and accordingly were to require theoretically no justification, and practically no compensation or amends, but existed, perhaps as represented by Spinoza and present-day Spinozists, as a single manifestation of a God who, for amusement, or even to mirror itself, undertook such a self-evolution, and consequently its existence needed neither to be justified by reasons nor redeemed by results, then the sufferings and troubles of life would not indeed have to be fully compensated by the pleasures and well-being in it. For, as I have said, this is impossible, because my present pain is never abolished by future pleasures, since the latter fill up their time just as the former fills its own. On the contrary, there would have to be no sufferings at all, and of necessity there would also be not death, or else it would have no terrors for us. Only thus would life pay for itself. Now, since our state or condition is rather something that it were better should not be, everything that surrounds us bears the traces of this, just as in hell everything smells of sulfur, since everything is always imperfect and deceptive. Everything agreeable is mixed with something disagreeable. Every enjoyment is always only half an enjoyment. Every gratification introduces its own disturbance. Every relief, new worries and troubles. Every expedient for our daily and hourly needs leaves us in the lurch at every moment and denies its service. The step onto which we tread so often gives way under us. In fact, misfortunes and accidents, great and small, are the element of our life. And, in a word, we are like Phineas, all of whose food was contaminated and rendered unfit to eat by the harpies. All that we lay hold on resists us, because it has a will of its own which must be overcome. 2 remedies for this are tried. Firstly, prudence, foresight, cunning. It does not teach us fully, is not sufficient, and comes to naught. Secondly, stoical, equanimity, seeking to disarm every misfortune by preparedness for all, and contempt for everything. In practice, this becomes cynical renunciation, which prefers to reject once for all every means of help and every alleviation. It makes us dogs, like Diogenes in his tub. The truth is, we ought to be wretched and are so. The chief source of the most serious evils affecting humanity is human beings. Homo homini lupus. The person who keeps this last fact clearly in view beholds the world as a hell, surpassing that of Dante by the fact that one person must be the devil of another. For this purpose, of course, one is more fitted than another. Indeed, an arch-fiend is more fitted than all the rest, and appears in the form of a conqueror who sets several 100,000 people facing one another and exclaims to them, "To suffer and die is your destiny. Now shoot one another with musket and cannon." And they do so. In general, however, the conduct of people towards one another is characterized by a rule of injustice, extreme unfairness, hardness, and even cruelty. An opposite course of conduct appears only by way of exception. The necessity for the state and for legislation rests on this fact, and not on your shifts and evasions. But in all cases, not lying within the reach of the law, we see at once a lack of consideration for one's fellow beings which is peculiar to human beings, and springs from their boundless egoism, and sometimes even from wickedness. How human beings deal with themselves is seen, for example, in slavery in America, the ultimate object of which is sugar and coffee. However, we need not go so far. To enter at the age of 5 a cotton spinning or other factory, and from then on to sit there every day, first 10, then 12, and finally 14 hours, and perform the same mechanical work, is to purchase dearly the pleasure of drawing breath. But this is the fate of millions, and many more millions have an analogous fate. We others, however, can be made perfectly miserable by trifling incidents, but perfectly happy by nothing in the world. Whatever we may say, the happiest moment of the happy person is that of falling asleep, just as the unhappiest moment of the unhappy person is that of awakening. An indirect but certain proof of the fact that people feel unhappy, and consequently are so, is also abundantly afforded by the terrible envy that dwells in us all. In all circumstances of life, on the occasion of every superiority or advantage, of whatever kind it be, this envy is roused and cannot contain its poison, because people feel unhappy. They cannot bear the sight of one who is supposed to be happy. Whoever feels happy for the moment would at once like to make all around them happy and say, "May every one here be happy in my joy." If life in itself were a precious blessing, and decidedly preferable to non-existence, the exit from it would not need to be guarded by such fearful watchmen as death and its terrors. But who would go on living life as it is if death were less terrible? And who could bear even the mere thought of death if life were a pleasure? But the former still always has the good point of being the end of life, and we console ourselves with death in regard to the sufferings of life, and with the sufferings of life in regard to death. The truth is that the two belong to each other inseparably, since they constitute a deviation from the right path, and a return to this is as difficult as it is desirable. If the world were not something that, practically expressed, ought not to be, it would also not be theoretically a problem. On the contrary, its existence would either require no explanation at all, since it would be so entirely self-evident that astonishment at it and inquiry about it could not arise in any mind, or its purpose would present itself unmistakably. But instead of this, it is indeed an insoluble problem. Even the most perfect philosophy will always contain an unexplained element, like an insoluble precipice, or the remainder that is always left behind by the irrational proportion of two quantities. Therefore, If anyone ventures to raise the question why there is not nothing at all, rather than this world, then the world cannot be justified from itself. No ground, no final cause of its existence can be found in itself. It cannot be demonstrated that it exists for its own sake. In other words, for its own advantage. In pursuance of my teaching, this can, of course, be explained from the fact that the principle of the world's existence is expressly a groundless one, namely a blind will to live, which, as thing in itself, cannot be subject to the principle of sufficient reason or ground, for this principle is merely the form of phenomena, and through it alone every why is justified. But this is also in keeping with the nature and constitution of the world, for only a blind, not a seeing, will could put itself in the position in which we find ourselves. On the contrary, a seeing will would soon have made the calculation that the business does not cover the costs, since such a mighty effort and struggle with the exertion of all one's strength, under constant care, anxiety, and want, and with the inevitable destruction of every individual life, finds no compensation in the ephemeral existence itself, which is obtained by such effort, and comes to nothing in our hands. Therefore, the explanation of the world from the intellect of Anaxagoras, in other words, from a will guided by knowledge, necessarily demands for its extenuation optimism, which is then set up and maintained in spite of the loudly crying evidence of a whole world full of misery. Life is then given out as a gift, whereas it is evident that anyone would have declined it with thanks had they looked at it and tested it beforehand, just as Lessing admired the understanding of his son. Because his son had absolutely declined to come into the world, he had to be dragged forcibly into life by means of forceps, but hardly was he in it when he again hurried away from it. On the other hand, it is well said that life should be, from one end to the other, only a lesson, to which, however, anyone could reply, "For this reason, I wish I had been left in the peace of the all-sufficient nothing, where I should have had no need either of lessons or of anything else." But if it were added that one day a person was to give an account of every hour of their life, they would rather be justified in first asking for an account as to why they were taken away from that peace and quiet and put into a position so precarious, obscure, anxious, and painful. To this, then, false fundamental views lead. Far from bearing the character of a gift, human existence has entirely the character of a contracted debt. The calling in of this debt appears in the shape of the urgent needs, tormenting desires, and endless misery brought about through that existence. As a rule, the whole lifetime is used for paying off this debt. Yet in this way, only the interest is cleared off. Repayment of the capital takes place through death. And when was this debt contracted? At the begetting.